Yes, yes, Khushnam, I think we can begin. I just got a signal from my team that we are now live stream on YouTube. So I think we let's not. I mean, I think we will have participants joining in. Thank you
Let's
all
wait a little.
and
Yes.
for joining. So good evening. I am Manish Dabhade here, and I'm the founder of the Indian Futures. I take this opportunity to welcome you all today on behalf of the Indian Futures. I obviously cannot but begin by hoping that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Let me at the outset, as I always do, introduce the Indian Futures very briefly. We are a New Delhi based independent organization that started out in January 2016 with the sole aim of creating a global platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss, in the truest ancient Indian tradition of a samvad, a dialogue, the ideas of New India in all their varied dimensions and contestations. The idea is to go beyond the headlines of the day and have a very honest, deep dive conversation amongst the thinking community, not only in India but abroad. The idea is to organize, probe, stimulate, and at times provoke our minds on a contemporary theme of critical relevance to India and the world. We are extremely proud to have recently hosted some of India's finest minds to begin with from the world of government, politics, academia, diplomacy, and culture. So we have had former cabinet ministers, former chief ministers of different states speaking to us. Recently, the Minister of State for External Affairs, Shri V. Muralidharan, spoke with us. The President of the Indian Council of Cultural Relations, Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, has also spoken to us several times. We have had Ambassador Raghavan, who was the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board since till very recently. Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, and Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, all recently retired foreign secretaries of India. Different ambassadors, for example, to China, to Pakistan, Professor Raja Mohan, Professor Makrand Paranjpe, all, and I'm just naming only a few who have spoken to us. And these are only we have only the national names I've talked about, but we have also had international participants. In fact, just a couple of months ago, we organized a 2 day international workshop on Quad in the Indo-Pacific, and we have had participants from Japan, obviously from India, but also from Australia and the US. So we have had many participants joining, speakers, very distinguished speakers, former ambassadors joining us. We also had the Australian ambassador, High Commissioner to India, speaking with us at that said program. So we have been trying to reach out to really top minds all over the globe to come and reflect on very important issues of relevance, not only to those specific regions but to the entire world. And in this context, I'm extremely delighted that we have with us Professor Chuck Freilich, who has been the Deputy National Security Advisor of Israel, and also is a renowned academic. He's a professor at Tel Aviv University, and Columbia University, was also a senior fellow at Harvard. So it's great to have. And with this, I now invite Dr. Khushnam, who is the Director of Research of the Indian Futures, to take it from here. So over to you, Dr. Khushnam.
Thank you. Thank you, Manish. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Manish, yes. Namaste and good evening to all, and welcome to the Indian Futures Distinguished Lecture, the return to Iran nuclear deal, implications for Israel and the world. And the distinguished speaker of the day is Professor Chuck Freilich, a former Deputy National Security Advisor of Israel and longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, a professor of political science at Harvard, Columbia, New York University, and Tel Aviv University. He's the author of Zion's Dilemma: How Israel Makes National Security Policy, and Israeli National Security, a new strategy for an era of change. He has published numerous academic articles and appears frequently on US, Israeli, and international TV and radio media channels. His book, Israeli National Security, a new strategy for an era of change, is the most exhaustive and comprehensive study and analysis of Israel's national security so far. It has taken a broad perspective on Israel's national security and combines the traditional element with such contemporary challenges as diplomatic isolation, delegitimization, and demographic challenges. It argues for an appropriate change in orientation in long-term basis, strategic, restrained, and focused diplomacy to deal with the changing security threats to the country, like loss of public support in Europe in particular, and similarly disturbing trends in the United States in the recent years. The demographic threat to the Israel's future as a democratic nation state of Jewish people is stemming from the de facto annexation of West Bank and the growing emergence of a one state reality. However, Iranian nuclear ambition is the most pernicious challenge and immediate existential threat to Israel. In this context, Professor Chuck Freilich is surely the most appropriate person to analyze and make us understand the implication of US return to Iran nuclear deal, the theme of the day. Israel has been very skeptical of Iran nuclear deal from the very beginning. Now, at this moment, Israel concerns are removal of the very critical sunset clause of the deal. Anywhere, anytime inspection of the Iranian nuclear sites, inclusion of Iran's missile program into the deal, Iran's malign activities and proxies in the region, regular consultation with Israel before final return to the JCPOA, that is Iran nuclear deal, and credible military option in the case of non-compliance by Iran and the subsequent threat to Israel's national security. And Israel's challenges at the moment are how far Israel will be able to accommodate its demand in the possible US resumption to the Iran nuclear deal. In the wake of possible return to the deal, what will be possible and prudent course of Israel in preventing Iran from going nuclear? As US seem to be decided to go for the resumption of the deal with assured Iranian commitments, how Israel is going to manage its special relation with US to retain its qualitative military edge, important for its strategic security and national security. And the comprehensive strategic partnership of Iran is for Israel, so far as Iran is concerned. The changing US public opinion can impact on Israel's national security with the possible return to the deal. Besides, what are the implications for the region and its peace and security? Besides, we have one more important point: is the Begin Doctrine option still viable? In May 1981, Prime Minister Begin expounded the lessons of the most important lessons of the Holocaust. And he said, I quote, "If an enemy of our people says he seeks to destroy us, believe him. Don't doubt him for a moment. Never pause to wonder what the world will think or say." Unquote. In brief, the Begin Doctrine instructs and calls for destruction of a military nuclear capability that could be used against Israel. Israel's Operation Opera in Iraq in 1981 and the Operation Out of Box in September 2007 in Syria have been successful. However, how far the doctrine remains viable at present in the case of Iran? What are the tactical and technical challenges given the distance and Iran's nuclear sites spread over different and difficult locations? Iran's capabilities to respond, direct or through its proxies, Iran's response against the facilitating Arab states, international reactions, and managing the great powers. It may close the diplomacy option of Israel to a large extent and can further complicate its Palestine policy. With these words, I welcome once again all of you and Professor Chuck Freilich. We are looking forward to an enlightening session ahead, which would help us to understand the possible ways to avoid a crisis between the two of our most important strategic partners in our crucial extended neighborhood, West Asia. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat. Over to Dr. Manish for taking the session forward. Manish, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Khushnam, for this very wonderful introduction. With this, now I invite Professor, without any further ado, the floor is all yours, sir, the virtual floor.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening. for the flattering introduction. And after hearing your description of the program, I think I'm particularly flattered to have the opportunity to be addressing you today. I'm going to address 5 primary questions in my opening remarks. I'll speak for probably just a little over a half hour. And then I'm happy to take any and all questions, agreements, disagreements, whatever the case may be. So the first question is, why does Iran want a military nuclear capability? And it is my working assumption, one that I am personally firmly convinced of, that Iran wants a military capability. And to be honest, I think Iran has got very good strategic reasons of its own for wanting a military capability. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to agree with them on it. That's not the point. But the important point is to recognize Iran's strategic thinking, and that from their perspective, they really do have a variety of very good reasons. First of all, if you look at the world from Tehran, I think you basically see the United States on all sides. There are American allies in the immediate region. There are American military bases and other facilities and capabilities in the immediate region. The United States toppled 2 neighboring regimes in the space of 2 years, just about 20 years ago today. The Taliban in Afghanistan, Iran's primary ideological rival, and then Saddam Hussein in Iraq, their primary strategic rival. The Bush administration spoke explicitly about regime change in Iran had things gone a little bit more successfully in Iraq. As a matter of fact, there has been legislation in the United States on the books, congressional legislation, ever since the revolution, calling for regime change. Now, not all American administrations have pursued that objective to the same extent. Some actually haven't, but some certainly have. So Bush was speaking about it, and had things gone well in Iraq, I think Iran was next on the list. In point of fact, the United States is probably the only existential threat to the Islamic Republic. No one else can threaten their very existence. Secondly, and this was the original impetus for the nuclear program, but has decreased greatly in importance over the years. The original impetus was, of course, the 8-year-long war with Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, a horrifically bloody war. Something like 500,000 Iranians lost their lives in that war. The precise number is unknown, probably a similar number of Iraqis. But for Iran, it remains an open wound to this day. There are memorial services, there are monuments all around Iran commemorating the events. Iran remembers very vividly the sense of being completely alone in the world, including when Saddam was firing chemical missiles at them, and no one in the world cared particularly. That was the original impetus, and of course, Iraq does not present a significant threat to Iranian security today, at least not a military threat. A third strategic consideration is Pakistan. And that's a topic that you all, I'm sure, know far more about than I do. But for Iran, Pakistan is a long-standing Sunni rival, a, shall we say, less than stable regime with a large nuclear arsenal. And no one wants to see, I mean, it's not as if the relationship between the two is a particularly bad one. They cooperate reasonably well, but no one wants to see a nuclear arsenal right on their border, especially given the instability of the regime. There's the confrontation with Israel that I'll come back to in a minute. Iran, I believe, also wants to be, at a bare minimum, the regional leader in the Middle East, possibly the regional hegemon. There's reason to believe that that's the objective. And they believe that a nuclear capability will enable them to achieve that objective. Add to this a long-time Shia sense of vulnerability, of being, if you will, a Shia island in a Sunni sea, a historic sense of vulnerability, going back to Persian history. They have long ago turned the nuclear program into a cause célèbre, and it's a matter of national pride for Iran. The regime has convinced the public that this is a civil nuclear program alone, and the evil United States and others seek to deprive them of their legitimate right to nuclear power under the NPT. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, are the ones who are in charge of the nuclear program, and they have a vested institutional interest in this. It provides jobs, the ability to provide patronage, a huge source of budgets, of influence, political influence. So if you put aside all of the various strategic reasons for wanting and the political reasons for wanting a nuclear program, for the IRGC, it's just a matter of their own self-interest. And finally, in terms of Iran's reasons for wanting a nuclear program, I think they look at three precedents that inform their thinking. The first is Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who had a nuclear program. Well, we know that for sure. Israel bombed the reactor in '81. The United States then destroyed the nuclear and other WMD programs in the first Gulf War. It subsequently turned out, big intelligence failure, that they had not reconstituted by the time of the second Gulf War. I'm one of those who believe that had it not been for the second Gulf War, they would have reconstituted, and today we probably would face a nuclear Iraq. But in any event, the lesson that the Iranians learned from this case was that Saddam misplayed his cards. He thumbed his nose at the United States too early. In the first Gulf War, he was maybe surprisingly allowed to remain in power and to live. He then had the, shall we say, lack of foresight to do so a second time, to thumb his nose at the US, and he was removed and killed. Now, had he waited just a little bit longer, another year or two, not much more than that, the sanctions regime and the inspections regime had essentially dissipated at that point. Had he waited a little bit more, he could have had the nuclear capability, and then he probably could have done what he wanted. Because once you achieve nukes, you seem to gain impunity. The second precedent is Gaddafi in Libya, who I believe mistakenly became so concerned after the second Gulf War that he was the next on the American hit list. He wasn't, it was Iran. But he became paranoid, if you will, whatever. He turns to the US and to the UK and just about begs them to be allowed to give up his nuclear program in exchange for re-acceptance into the international community, so to speak. And that happens. A decade later, a little bit less, the Arab Spring breaks out. He's about to be toppled. NATO launches an attack, and he's toppled. Well, the second lessons that the Iranians learn is he also misplayed his cards. Had he not given up the nuclear capability, nobody would have touched him in 2011. And the third precedent is, of course, North Korea, which for decades thumbed its nose at the US, but it never quite went too far. Waited till it crossed the threshold in the early 2000s, till it had a few nuclear weapons. And ever since then, it's been doing whatever it wants, and nobody touches them, because when you have nukes, you gain impunity. So to sum up this first question, I started out by saying that Iran has got very good strategic reasons for wanting a military nuclear capability. And I think those are probably the primary ones. The second question is, what are the sources of this deep, decades-long enmity between Iran and Israel? And it's not really between Iran and Israel so much as between the Islamic Republic and Israel. Some of you may know that under the Shah, Israel and Iran had a good relationship. And I don't think there's a problem between Israel and the Iranian people. It really is with the Islamic Republic. Now, you don't have here any of the normal sources of enmity or of interstate conflict. Okay, Iran is 1,300 kilometers away from Israel, meaning that there's no common border, so there's no common territory to fight about. There are no ethnic groups along the border to worry about. There are no conflicts of economic interest, far away. So why is there this deep enmity? And what I would submit to you, this is very different, let's say, from the Palestinian issue, where Israel has some own positions, demands of its own. On the Iranian issue, bottom line, I think the only thing that Israel really wants from Iran is leave us alone. You're far away. Be well, prosper if you can. We shouldn't be in a state of conflict. Now, obviously, we are in a state of conflict, and so Israel does have demands, whether it's dismantling the nuclear program, ballistic missiles, etc. But fundamentally, Israel's strategic objective vis-a-vis Iran is to be left alone. And in this case, I think that the enmity, at its source at least, is fundamentally one-sided. And the question is why? And of course, there are a number of reasons. Some of them include the fact that Israel supported the Shah, that it's identified as an ally of the United States. Differences over the Palestinian issue. Israel is thought to be a nuclear power in its own right, and that, of course, conflicts with Iran's regional ambitions. The fact that the revolution uses Israel as one of the last, the Republic uses Israel as one of the last issues that they can use to rally the people around the flag, because the revolution is 40 years old. People are getting a little bit tired of coming out in the streets and demonstrating and screaming and shouting. And basically, you can still get a little bit support for down with the US, but a little bit more with down with Israel. I think the real reason, I mean, all of those are contributing factors, but the real reason is that I believe that Iran, or again, the Islamic Republic, cannot live with a non-Muslim majority state in the region. They can live with non-Muslim minorities, Jewish or Christian, it doesn't matter. But a majority Jewish state is something that is fundamentally antithetical to what this regime is about. And I think that's the real issue. The supreme leader famously announced a 14-point plan for, excuse me, a 9-point plan for Israel's destruction in 2014. From Iran's point of view, it's a fundamentalist regime. It can take a few decades. Doesn't really matter quite how long it takes. They've announced 2040 as being the decisive year, but if it's 2050 or 60 or 70, that's okay also. Their sense of time, I think, is fundamentally different from that of democracies. And there's also a fundamental difference in their approach towards Israel and the US, in that the great Satan is really as fundamentally misguided in its approach, but if it would see the light and change its approach, Iran could live with it. I don't think that there's anything that Israel could do, any change in its policies whatsoever, that would make it an acceptable partner for Iran, or something that Iran could live with in the region. The third questions are, what does it mean for the international community if Iran goes nuclear? The next question will be, what does it mean for Israel? But what does it mean for the international community? I think it will basically mean that we can sign away, we can almost sign a death certificate for the NPT. No one will do it formally. But if Iran gets away with it, after Syria, Libya, and Iraq almost got away with it, and North Korea did, if despite a couple of decades, actually at this point it's almost 4 decades of international efforts to prevent Iran from going nuclear, if it ends in a failure, there won't be too much left to the NPT, certainly as an effective international arms control regime. Now, I believe that if Iran goes nuclear, we will probably see a cascading effect. The Saudis, the Turks, Egypt are the three likely candidates to go nuclear after Iran. Israel is, as I said, thought to be a nuclear power. I would submit to you that the idea of a multi-nuclear or multi-power, a Middle East in which there are multiple nuclear powers, is a nightmare scenario for which there is no good response. And let me give you just a few examples of what I mean. Iran and Egypt do not have diplomatic relations. Iran and Saudi Arabia do not have diplomatic relations. So imagine now the crisis management in the nuclear crisis. Iran and Turkey have an okay relationship today. Turkey and Egypt and Turkey and Saudi Arabia have a bad relationship. Turkey and Israel have a terrible relationship today. Hardly talk, a little bit. Israel and Saudi Arabia can convey messages. Israel and Iran basically cannot. They have no direct channels of communication. You can send a message through some third party, and hopefully it will get there within some reasonable amount of time and hopefully be conveyed appropriately. The problem is you don't really have good channels of communication between almost any of the players, and there's deep enmity between many of them. Now, also, a Middle East in which there are multiple nuclear players, aside from being multiple, I believe is very different from either the American-Soviet, American/Russian, or the Indo-Pakistani nuclear balances. I don't think a comparison here is a fully appropriate one. First of all, in none of the other cases does one of the sides believe that it has a direct line to God himself. The Islamic Republic defines itself as the embodiment of the divine word on earth. Now that's quite a mouthful, but it also means that this is a unique regime. I'm one of the people who actually thinks that the Islamic Republic is a essentially rational actor in political science terms. I think they're a very extreme actor, but that doesn't make them irrational. On the other hand, I don't know if the rationality of a theocracy, especially in a crisis, maybe it's a tiny drop different from the rationality that we attribute to non-theocratic regimes. And actually, if we're talking a multi-powered, nuclear-powered Middle East, the Saudis are a theocracy as well. So we would have two theocracies playing. That's one fundamental difference between the US-Soviet and the Indo-Pakistani balances. Another is that here we have one of the players, Iran, which calls explicitly and repeatedly, almost on a daily basis, for the destruction of one of the other players, Israel. The US and the Soviet Union never wanted to destroy each other, not physically. They may have wanted to defeat the other side's political system, the economic system, but the Russians never wanted to kill every last American or vice versa. And the same holds true for India and Pakistan. That's not the case with Iran's policy towards Israel. And so I think the consequences for the region and the world, if we have a Middle East with multiple nuclear players, even if it's limited in the early years just to Iran and Israel, assuming that Israel has the capabilities that are attributed to it, this is an unprecedented situation. If Iran succeeds in going nuclear, it also means that much of the world's energy supply would now be under their indirect control, okay? Subject to a potential Iranian nuclear attack and subject to their regional influence. And that's something that I think the leading powers in the world do not, or certainly should not, want to see happen. Certainly for the next few decades, while oil and gas are the primary sources of international energy. All right, the fourth question is, what does a nuclear Iran mean for Israel? Now, I think there are essentially two schools of thought about this in Israel. This is a division of my own, a conceptual division of my own, but I think it sums up the picture. And the difference between these two schools of thought seems limited, but you'll see in a minute it's not quite that limited. There's one school of thought that views a nuclear Iran as being simply an existential threat in the narrow sense of the word. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they will use it sooner or later. Maybe not the next morning, but sooner or later. And if you believe that a nuclear Iran is absolutely existential, the logical policy conclusion that one would derive from that, I believe, is that Israel would have to do everything in its ability to prevent this from happening, because every other option, no matter how bad it might be, is preferable to facing an imminent existential threat. And so Israel really would have essentially no option but to go the military route. The second approach, slightly narrower, says, well, Iran might be an existential threat. We can't discount that. But the likelihood of their ever actually using a nuclear weapon against Israel is really minor. They know what the consequences would be. And that the real threat that a nuclear Iran poses is not the existential one, but the effect that it would have on every other conflict in the region. So every time there's a conflict with Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, if Israel wants to act, and other issues, if Israel wants to act, it risks going to the nuclear level, to the existential level. And we know that states behave totally differently at the existential level, and Israel might be self-deterred, if you will. The Iranians might be able to dictate all sorts of terms. And so this threat, or this view of the threat, maybe isn't absolutely existential. It's still dire, and dire is bad enough. And if you ask what's at the source of the difference between these two views, it's the issue of Iranian rationality. Those in the first school of thought clearly attach greater irrationality to Iran than those in the second school of thought. If you ask me, what is Iran's acceptable threshold for pain here? Or what price are they willing to pay for the joy of wiping Israel off the face of the earth? 10,000 people, I think absolutely. 20,000 people, yes. 50, 100, 500,000. Where's the cutoff point? They lost 500,000 people in the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war. That's why I mentioned it before. It is a deep national trauma to this day. Here, they don't lose 500,000 people. If we get into a nuclear war, they lose many, many, many times that in the first 8 minutes, not 8 years. Again, assuming that Israel has the capabilities that are commonly attributed to it. That sounds to me totally irrational on their part, and I attribute at least basic rationality to them, and I think beyond that. I think actually one of the things that makes Iran such a dangerous player from Israel's point of view is that it's actually, it may be extremist, but it's a very, very carefully calculating player. They think very deeply about their policies. And now the last and the most crucial question, and that is, okay, if that's the situation, what can we do about it? What are the policy options? And in a minute, I'll talk about 5 different options for addressing the issue. But let me just state a couple of premises before doing so. And the first premise is that Iran is essentially already today nuclear threshold state, just about a nuclear threshold state. Depending on which assessment you want to read, they're about 3 months away from having enough fissile material for a first bomb. And if it's 4 months, or if it's 2 months, what's the difference? They've essentially got the material for the first bomb. They probably need another year, maybe 2 years, if you're more optimistic, to miniaturize the warhead and be able to place it on a missile, being the primary delivery means available to them. So months from a first bomb, if they wish to cross the threshold, it's not predetermined that they will, but if they want to, and 2 years for the delivery vehicle, that's not a lot of time. A second premise is that the nuclear program can no longer be eliminated. They have the know-how, the technology, even a perfectly effective military strike that raised every nuclear installation down to zero, they can rebuild it because they've got the know-how. Iran, the third premise, Iran could have crossed the threshold and had a military capability sometime around 2010, maybe earlier. They chose not to because the price of crossing the threshold, the international price, was so heavy that they decided to take a longer term approach and be able to break out at a more appropriate time. They didn't need the capability necessarily at that time. They wanted to achieve it under the best possible circumstances. And I think they still have flexibility in terms of the timing, maybe even long-term flexibility. And the last of the background premises is that the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, was not what anyone wanted. The nature of compromise deals is that no one is 100% satisfied. If they are, that's usually a dictate, not a compromise deal. Obama said quite openly at the time, this was not the deal he wanted. When the negotiations started, the American position was that Iran would not be allowed to have any nuclear capability left whatsoever. He said this was the deal that I could achieve. Now, American critics of the deal, Mr. Netanyahu, claimed that actually Iran was pretty much on the ropes at the time. And if that the US had held out just for another few months, a better deal could have been achieved. Well, that's history. We don't know the answer to it. If they were right, if the critics were right, then this was a badly misnegotiated deal and shouldn't have been signed. And if they were wrong, then this really was maybe the best that the Americans could have achieved at the time. And before now turning to the different options, I should just say that the primary criticism of the deal was that A, it left the essential nuclear infrastructure intact, that there were the so-called sunset clauses, in other words, that the deal expires after 10 to 15 years, and third, that it didn't address some of the other issues, such as the ballistic missile issue and Iran's regional activities. All right, now before addressing the 5 options, and in the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that I was an early supporter of the JCPOA and remain one to this day, not because I think it was a perfect deal, and frankly, I think the Americans were out-negotiated, but because I think it was the best of the bad options that were available at the time, and unfortunately that are still available to us at this time. One of the options is a military attack, and the likely candidates for that are either the US or Israel. We might still reach the point, and that point might, by the way, not be very far off, where military action is required. And my own personal belief is that after exhausting every possible alternative, if and when Iran is about to really cross the threshold, I don't think Israel has any choice but to act militarily, even though I don't think we'll gain a lot of time. But a military attack assumes a whole variety of variables, for example, that you know where all the critical targets are. Let's say we do, there aren't that many, and Iran seems to be highly penetrated from an intelligence perspective. All right, so, but do we really know where all the critical targets are? Can we destroy them all? It's a small number, frankly. For the US, this is a simple operation, actually. For Israel, it's the outer limits of its operational capability. Israel's not a global superpower like the United States. It's maybe a regional one. And Iran has built the Fordo facility, the one where they hollowed out the center of a big mountain outside the city of Qom. And then they built a few meters of reinforced concrete and put the enrichment facility in there. The United States built an entire special bomb, the massive ordnance penetrator, to be able to blow up this entire mountain. It's not known that Israel has any such capability. It certainly doesn't have the B-52 or B-2s required to deliver it. So I think the US can do this, and it could level all of the Iranian facilities. It's not clear that Israel could do so. What is the price of action? Some people fear a regional war. I think that that's greatly outstated. And I think the Iranians are too wise to respond in any significant way against the US, regardless of who actually does it. I think most of their response will be directed towards Israel. And that's why they built up the mammoth Hezbollah rocket arsenal, which may today be actually 150,000 rockets, all aimed at Israel. Israel's a tiny country. That's a really mammoth number. There are all sorts of other repercussions. Anyone who does it once would have to be willing to go in a second time because the Iranians may reconstitute it. And here's the real problem, is that even if it's a perfectly successful program, as I said, they've got the technology. They can rebuild. How long will it take them? Some people have said as little as a year. That sounds kind of unrealistic to me. It assumes perfect 24-hour, 24/7 building activities. It doesn't work that way with big infrastructure projects. Some people said 5 years. That seems too optimistic to me. So what do we gain? Maybe 3-4 years at a considerable price. A second option is sabotage, whether it's cyber sabotage, kinetic sabotage. The US and Israel are jointly thought to have launched the Stuxnet operation back in 2010. And last year and this year, there were kinetic attacks on the Natanz enrichment facility attributed to Israel. In all of these cases, of the 3 attacks I just mentioned, the estimates ran from 1 to 2 years for each attack. Whoever's behind these attacks and others, it doesn't matter at the moment, they gain time. And that's important. And over years, if you keep gaining time, that's even more important. It doesn't solve the problem. A third option that people talk about is regime change. Maybe that there would be a new democratic, friendly regime in Iran. Of course, that would be a very welcome outcome. Or maybe just a less hostile regime, and maybe one that would forego its nuclear capability. The only problem with this option is that everybody, I think every major intelligence agency in the world has probably been trying to figure out how to topple the regime ever since the revolution in '79. And I don't think anybody is any closer to knowing how to do it today than they were at the time. If and when regime change comes to Iran, I believe it will have to come from the inside, not from the outside. And that could happen any time from 5 years from now, or 5 minutes from now, or 50 years from now. And I don't think we can give a more precise assessment, meaning that this isn't really a practical option for policy purposes. The fourth option is economic sanctions, something that the US has imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iran ever since '96, and since 2012, then until 2015, or really 16, There were comprehensive international sanctions, and then the US withdrew from the agreement in 2018, and Trump imposed the so-called maximum pressure approach of sanctions. The sanctions have had a huge effect on the Iranian economy, devastated the economy, but the objective was never to cause Iran pain, it was to get it to change its policy. We saw in 2012 and again in 2015, the sanctions were enough to get Iran to compromise, but not to give up on the capability. Maybe if Mr. Trump had had another 4 years, maybe he could have achieved the objective. At the point we are now, the policy failed abysmally. Not only did it not get Iran to change its policy in the desired direction, it did exactly the opposite. The fifth option is a nuclear agreement. And the question is whether, well, the Biden administration's approach is, let's try and go back to the old deal as a basis for then negotiating a new deal. The problem with that approach is that in order to reach the old deal, and I think the question mark whether that is actually achievable is growing by the day, maybe Iran really doesn't want it, but to the extent that it is an achievable option, it requires that the US essentially forego all of the sources of leverage that it had over Iran. Most of them. That further reduces any interest Iran might have in reaching what the US would call a new and better deal, because any deal that is new and better for the United States is by definition worse for Iran. And why would the Iranians agree to a worse deal when it was the US that pulled out of the agreement for no justifiable reason? They weren't in violation of the agreement. The US essentially violated it. As far as the hardliners in Iran are concerned, and they're the ones who are ascendant, and Mr. Raisi is a clear hardliner. As far as they're concerned, they were totally justified in their concerns and in their warnings to their colleagues at the time. They said, you can't trust the United States. It will renege on the agreement. And at least from their perspective, they were proven correct. So we're now at the point where if we don't reach an agreement very soon, it's becoming very questionable whether an agreement can be reached. You can also start saying, well, is it really worth going back to an agreement when there are, at this point, less than 4.5 years left to the first stage when many of the limitations come off, and only 9.5 years till everything else comes off. And that then leaves Iran with an essentially intact civil nuclear infrastructure, and then the ability to break out, if they so wish, in virtually zero time. So let me stop with that. I probably spoke a few minutes more than I intended to, and I'm happy to take your questions. And of course, disagreements are always welcome as well.
Thank you, Professor. I think this was a very brilliant address, and again, very clear in that sense that you really started out by, okay, these are the 5 sets of questions you would be answering, and I think that really made the job so much easy for many who have joined here, but obviously many who are also, seeing us on live YouTube. So I think you started out very importantly, I think, why Iran wants nuclear capability, and I think there is a consensus that there are solid strategic reasons why Iran would be looking for a nuclear weapon capability. Also, another very important, I think, the second set of question that ultimately the Islamic nature of the regime and what it means for Israel and how it looks at Israel seems to be a big driver. I think that's a very important point which not many really think about. Also, the larger implication, I think, for the international community in terms of what does it mean for the NPT, which is such a important regime, and all the major powers, major players do back it in many ways. So it would surely have implications for the NPT. I think that's a very important point. Also, coming to, I think, a very important distinction which you drew about how Israel looks at Iran, nuclear Iran, an existential or just in terms of deterrence. And I think here we would also like maybe in the Q&A stage, is there a difference between how Netanyahu saw Iran and the current government looks at Iran? I think that is what maybe you could answer it later. But very important also on ending on pointing out really 5 different options, and why coming back to the nuclear agreement seems to be as it it seems that is what many are banking on, nuclear agreement going back to some version of JCPOA seems to be the only road ahead. So I think this was really brilliant, and I personally, learned so much about. There is so much noise coming out, and in fact, in various newspapers and media outlets, and also even analysts. But I think you really brilliantly addressed each of the key questions most of us would have in mind on this issue. So thank you, Professor, for this brilliant address. With this, we now open up for Q&A, and maybe we can start with Dr. Khushnam. I'm sure Khushnam is with us.
Yes, thank you, Manish. And thank you, Professor. It was very nicely analyzed and a very calibrated way. And all the options were given, and what are the strategic need of Iran to go nuclear, and all the options. And what are the options right now, the limitations of US policies, everything was taken covered. But I see the things in the West Asia from the perspective of Indian strategic interest. From our point of view, from Indian strategic point of view, the entire region and the peace and stability is very important. And both the countries are very strategically important for us. Recently, last week, this week only, earlier this week, the Iranian spokesperson of the foreign ministry said that they want in the next round of talks, they want US decision to resume the nuclear deal, which should be subject to the sanction of United Nations Security Council, it looks very unlikely, and the Israeli media analyze it that no more that deal is possible. In this scenario, and given the stake for the national security of Israel, and you have already given the options for Iran and its interest in going for nuclear. So what is the best option now? Very basic question is that now the US should join the nuclear deal, or the other options are better at this moment? Because Iran is, as you said, Iran is already having the know-how. Anytime later on, they can decide and go for that. Professor, please. Thank you.
So thank you for the question. Let me just preface that by very quickly answering in one sentence Manish's question, if there's any significant difference between the previous government, Mr. Netanyahu's government, which was forced out a few weeks ago. The new government's been in office for just over a month. I would say that so far, in real substance, there isn't a significant difference. The difference is one in approach and how to handle it. In other words, a non-confrontational approach with the US and international community. But on substance, I think they view things pretty similarly to the previous government. But in terms of what's best from Israel's perspective, again, I said I come as someone who has a certain position on this. I think that contrary to the public image that was created in recent years, a large percentage of the Israeli defense establishment actually took the position that I did, which was not the position that Mr. Netanyahu took, which was that the JCPOA was and remains the best of the bad options, at least that it was. I think there's more disagreement whether that's still the case today, partly because Iran, so much time has gone by, over half of the agreement's basic lifetime is expired, and Iran is so close today that there's really concern about the breakout time. I believe that my approach to life is always, well, what are your alternatives? There is the world that I'd love to live in which Iran is not a nuclear power and does not pose a threat to the state of Israel. And there's a world that we live in, and that's that I went through the different options, and I don't think any of them are very good. Most of them are at best means of gaining time. Regime change could be more than just a change, a gain in time. That could be a fundamental solution to the problem, but that's an option which is not realistic, at least in a relevant time frame. So in the end, we're left with the other options. It seems to me that at this point, if we can still reach an agreement in the short term, that is the best option. I believe it will have to be made clear to the Iranians, if not now, then certainly before the agreement expires, that it actually never expires. And so that there will have to be a crisis point with them, whether it's now or a few years from now, but before year 10, that has to be made absolutely clear to them. And as I said before, I also believe that if and when the crunch comes, Israel has no alternative but to take military action, because even though I'm one of those who takes a somewhat more moderate view here, and I do not believe that Iran will ever actually use the nuclear capability against Israel, I think that the very existence of the possibility that it could happen, it's one of those cases where just about zero probability, but total impact if it actually happened. So I don't think that Israel can allow itself to see that happen.
Great. Professor, before we open up to even the questions flowing in, I had a couple of additional questions. One of the important in this whole matrix about Iran's nuclear weapon capabilities and program, obviously, is the US. So, in fact, the Jerusalem Post has come out with a very, very strong editorial against, Biden's approach on the Iran nuclear question. So, to what extent, and again, there is also pressure of sorts on the current government that, or even with Netanyahu earlier, that with the Democratic administration, it was always a big issue of divergence between Israel and the US. To what extent is that still a major concern for Israel, that somehow Biden is moving full throttle without taking Israeli concerns into consideration? That's number one question. And number two, you also spoke about leverages US might have even now on the JCPOA, returning back to the JCPOA. So, could you tell us what those leverages might be? Yes, sir.
But first of all, I think that Biden is a true friend of Israel's. He's got a lifelong proven track record. And I think he is certainly taking Israel's interests into account. I think he tried to engage in a good, substantive, behind-the-scenes dialogue with Mr. Netanyahu. And some of that was taking place. And I think that since Mr. Bennett came into office, the dialogue has improved greatly. There have been a number of very high-level visits in both directions. And I think that the level of understanding is much higher. And I think there's broad agreement. I mean, Israel still opposes the idea of going back to the old deal, but assuming that the US is determined to try and do that, beyond that, I think there is a great deal of agreement. And Israel's encouraged the Americans to think more about, well, what happens if the agreement is not reached? What are the consequences of that? Because I think that the US was totally focused on getting to the deal. They weren't really taking into account a possible failure. In any event, one thing is clear, that this government does not intend to turn this into an open confrontation. And the agreements will be behind the scenes, not beyond that. Look, the basic terms for going back to the old deal are that the US agrees to lift all of the additional sanctions that Trump imposed and all of the sanctions that were supposed to come off, or that came off with the original deal, meaning that you still have the non-nuclear sanctions on the ballistic missile program, human rights violations, maybe some other things, but most of the sanctions are lifted. So in a situation, and Iran then has billions and billions of dollars pouring in as it can renew oil exports unimpeded. So when you've given up most of the sources of leverage, not 100%, but let me make up a figure, 80 to 90% of them, what incentive does that give them to agree to a new deal, which, as I said before, is worse for them? And so there is, I think, a very good case to be made that even if you would like to go back to the old deal, you only do it as part of a package agreement where it's going back and there's agreement on the follow-on deal. I think the Biden administration came to the conclusion that that wasn't a realistic option. Unfortunately, I came to the conclusion that they're probably right, because I did not want to see the US give up this leverage. But then the choice, I think in the bottom line, the choice is either going back to the old deal and hoping that the US can use the limited leverage it still has to reach the new one, or no deal at all. And I still think that the first option is not quite as bad as the second one.
Great, Professor. I think you've answered this brilliantly. We have with us, in fact, I just wanted to inform you, share with all of you that we have with us Dr. Reshmi Kazi. She's Associate Professor in the Jamia Millia University. We have with us Dr. Aishu Ketkar, who teaches, who's a professor in National Security Studies in the JNU, and also many PhD students have joined us. So I now get in. Can I have Aditya ask a question? Aditya, please introduce yourself so that Professor knows where are you. I mean, calling from.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for providing this opportunity. Thank you, Professor, for this wonderful and wonderfully insightful talk. I really have got to know a lot of perspective, Israeli perspective. I'm Aditya Kumar Singh. I'm a master's student at JNU, International Studies. So I got two very small questions for you. One, as a student of international relations, we see these deals being signed.
I lost
Am I audible?
you. I lost you after you said that,
Okay,
that you're a master's student.
Sorry, sir. Now, am I audible now?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I'm a master's student of international relations at JNU, and it really had a very insightful talk, and thank you for that. So I got two very small questions for you. First, as a student of international relations, my perspective is these new peace deals that has been signed. One of the very common factor is Iran. Iran is a factor that has compelled the Israel and other regional players to come close. So I just wanted to understand: is this perspective relevant, or is it very much true to the reality? And the second question is, you talked about US role and Europe and Israel and other powers. So one thing I just wanted to understand, we have China, very common. China has invested heavily in Israel. It's a strategic partner of Iran. It's also a member of JCPOA committee. So I just want to understand, how is Israel trying to balance China vis-a-vis its policy towards Iran? Thank you, sir.
Okay, could you explain the first question? You said something about coming close. I didn't understand the point.
Sir, that was basically that Israel signed a peace deal with UAE and Bahrain, and all of them have a common enemy as Iran. So I just wanted to understand, is Iran a pushing factor for these countries to come together?
Okay, I didn't hear it. The answer is yes. In other words, there were a number of reasons that the UAE, Bahrain, officially, I think the Saudis under the table and other countries have started cooperating with Israel in recent years, and the UAE and Bahrain officially a year ago when they signed peace agreements. They also wanted it because they wanted access to Israeli high tech, because they wanted overall economic relations. But the driving factor was the common fear of Iran. That was the overwhelming fear. And I think in the last year, actually, or since Biden was elected, and they're less confident of the American role in the region, less confident of the fact that they have an effective American deterrent behind them. We've actually also seen some attempts on their part to improve relations with Iran, not because they want to and not because they really believe that it's going to go very far, but they want to reduce the risks. They don't rely fully on the US. And if they're not sure of the US, well, then you can say on the one hand, that really leaves them primarily with Israel as a potential partner, but maybe Israel's weakened when the US isn't playing as much in the region either. But yes, it was the driving factor. You asked correctly about China. China for decades wasn't much of a player in the region other than on an economic level. It buys vast quantities of Iranian and Saudi oil. They always had something of a diplomatic role because they are a permanent member of the Security Council. And they did support the sanctions of the JCPOA at one point. That was pretty unusual for China. China usually tries to stay neutral, to stay out of various conflicts around the world. I don't think that China considers a nuclear Iran to be a particular danger. Better that they don't have nuclear weapons, but even Russia is considerably more concerned about a nuclear Iran than China is. And Iran is clearly a major economic and strategic opportunity for China today, an opportunity to further push the US out of the Middle East, an opportunity in terms of the global US-Chinese confrontation. And last year we saw a dramatic, or actually I think it was only signed this year, a dramatic new cooperation agreement. Press reports were between $400 and $600 billion between China and Iran for oil sales, arms sales, cyber cooperation. We don't know the details, and they may be less ominous than some of the press reports indicated, but I think we're now beginning to see the era of Chinese involvement in the region beyond strategic involvement in the region. And of course, that's a source of concern for Israel, especially to the extent that it comes at the expense of the American role in the region. And Israel has to balance its relationship, its number one strategic relationship in the world, which was with the United States, against a relationship with China, and which has strategic and military dimensions to it, but at the bilateral level, it's mostly an economic relationship. It's a very important one because China has become a big focus of Israeli exports. It's become a huge source of investment in Israeli high tech. But still, so Israel tries to balance it, and it tries to avoid reaching a crisis with China, but it's clear that Israel has to give clear preference to its relationship with the US.
Great, Professor. We have with us Professor Reshmi Kazi, who is a professor of international relations. So, yeah, over to you, Dr. Kazi.
Thank you, Dr. Dabhade. Good evening to everybody, and thank you very much, Professor Charles Freilich. I hope I got your name pronounced correctly, and pardon me if I mispronounced your name.
It was close enough.
Thank you. So thank you very much again for that excellent presentation. You really summed it up so well. This is an area which is of much interest, because out in this part of the world, in South Asia, the deterrence stability model that if I can describe it that way, that exists between India and Pakistan. We have not the two nuclear neighbors, and now with advanced nuclear capabilities, we have survived various crises, including wars. At the risk of sounding patronizing, though that is not my intention at all, what would be your take if I have to ask you, the deterrence stability model that exists, or at least the very fact that we have not come, anywhere close to a nuclear flashpoint, even though there has been, like a rhetoric on both sides, there have been occasions for that. But we have not really, come anywhere close to that, in my opinion, a nuclear flashpoint, which has been described at times very vividly even at a very alarming level, particularly from the Western world. But my question, what I would like to ask you, what would be your take on having a deterrence model? Again, as I said, I don't want to sound patronizing here, but a likewise model, how do you think it can, or rather, any lessons can be drawn from it in this part of the world between Israel and Iran? Because I don't see this nuclear impasse. I don't think this is going to be, we cannot wish it away soon. This is going to be there for a while, and it has several implications, for the non-proliferation regime as, at a global level, which itself is in a very, weakened position as we see it. Your views, Professor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. I will try and answer it. I think I addressed already some of the differences between the Indo-Pakistani balance and a potential nuclear balance in the Mideast. And let me restate some of them. Israel does not wish to destroy Iran. Iran explicitly calls for Israel's destruction all of the time and has invested vast fortunes in that endeavor and has paid heavy prices over the decades for that position. So we take it very, very seriously. I believe that Iran really means it. We have to take into account that even if you're more, what should I call it, conservative, moderate in one's view, as I believe I am, I also do not discount the possibility that they might use a nuclear weapon. And again, we're talking a theocratic regime. So and Israel, I think we can agree, is slightly smaller than India. Our entire population is 9 million people in a country which is minute. Mr. Rafsanjani, the former Iranian president, famously once said that Israel is a one-bomb country, meaning that Iran could destroy Israel with one bomb. Probably a slight overstating of the case. To be more precise, they would probably need a handful. So our security margins are very, very, very narrow. And we can't afford to take significant risks, and maybe sometimes we're a little bit overly cautious, but our margins really, really are very narrow. I don't think we can rely to any extent on a presumption of a deterrent balance. And also remember that in the Indo-Pakistani case, you have the advantage of being the bigger and far more powerful side. We, at the moment, may have a military advantage, but we are by far the smaller side. Iran has got a population of around 80 million. The geographic differences are immense. And also remember that Israel has taken an entirely different approach towards its nuclear strategy than other countries. Israel maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity, whereby it neither confirms nor denies having a nuclear capability. And whether it does or does not, I mean, most of the world is convinced that Israel has had a nuclear capability for decades. But there's also a wall-to-wall consensus in Israel that that policy should not be changed. So that it would be hard to have that kind of balance when Israel doesn't acknowledge having the capability. I'm also not convinced that if Israel were to end the policy of ambiguity, it would make a difference, because I think the Iranians have to presume for their own planning purposes that the international assessment is correct. So I don't think that Israel actually would gain any additional deterrent value of any significance. Some people say a little bit. I personally don't even think that's the case, but at best a marginal increase in its deterrence. So we would probably not want to go the route of a nuclear balance. Now, if and when Iran ever goes nuclear, Israel may have to reconsider its approach. Like I said, I wouldn't favor changing it, but I'm sure people will think about it. And I think Israel's preferred route would be, if and when all diplomatic options have been exhausted, to go the military route. I hope I'm answering your question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Can we have, sir, with your permission, just last two quick questions before we wrap up. Abhishek, over to you.
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello. Thank you, sir. I am Abhishek. I am a PhD student at Jawaharlal Nehru University. My question is, you touched upon it, but you have not elaborated it. What do you think is the Israel's expectation from Biden administration on JCPOA?
Thanks, Abhishek. And Shubhranshu, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Subhranshu, pursuing my MPhil from JNU. My question is specific to Pakistan. You had mentioned about the fact that Sunni Pakistan's nuclear arsenal had some role to play in Iran's nuclear calculations. Is the assumption still valid? Because we have seen growing convergence between Pakistan and Iran's relationship. Iran talked about mediating between US and Iran, and Iran's president had talked about growing security partnership or trade or energy partnership between Iran and Pakistan. So that assumption still valid? And can we really count that in today's circumstances? And if yes, then why?
Is it valid because of what? Excuse me, I didn't hear.
If it's valid, then why? I'm asking. The Pakistan calculation in Iran's policy right now, nuclear.
No, why were you saying that it might no longer be valid? You gave a couple of reasons.
No, I think the growing convergence between Iran and Pakistan, because Imran Khan had talked about mediating between US and Iran, and Iranian president had said that Pakistan needs to collaborate more, in security paradigms, in trade, energy, as recently as April. So growing the convergence, keeping the convergence in mind, can we really say that that factor is still valid? That's a simple question.
Okay. So the first question were, what are Israel's expectations of the Biden administration? Well, the hopes are that it won't just go back to the old deal, but that it will concentrate on trying to reach a new and better deal. And in any event, even if it is just going back to the old deal at a first stage, it's not quite that simple, because there hasn't been a steady state situation. It's not as if everything froze in 2018 and nothing changed since then. Iran has progressed greatly. So what is rolling them back to what they were at the time? What exactly does that mean? Even if they dismantled things, if they did away with the highly enriched uranium, moved it outside to Russia or something, they've certainly, at a bare minimum, they've greatly strengthened their technological know-how in this time. So what additional measures. I don't know if they can be imposed on Iran if we're just going back to the old deal, but what other things can be done to reduce the threat? And most and foremost, making sure that the deal does not expire, or that a new deal replaces it, and that a new deal also addresses the other issues that were not addressed at the time, the ballistic missile program and Iran's growing regional expansionism. Now, Iran is trying very intensively in recent years to set up its own military presence in Syria, air, ground, and naval. And it has built up a huge presence of Shiite militias there, many tens of thousands. And it has begun building up, or not, no longer begun, it is in the process of trying to build up a Hezbollah presence there as well. Now, Hezbollah has got somewhere between 130 and 150,000 rockets in Lebanon. It'll be a while before they have that many in Syria, but the effort, their effort, is to create one joint Lebanese-Syrian border. If you can picture the map, Lebanon and Syria are bordering countries. They both border Israel to the north. The idea is to turn it into one joint front against Israel. And if you take the rockets in Lebanon, then add a similar number or a growing number in Syria to that number, I mean, this is just a vast threat right on Israel's border, on its border, and add the Iranian presence in Syria. This was actually, short of Iran going nuclear, this is actually the primary threat that Israel faces already today. And the next war, if and when it breaks out with Hezbollah, is going to be an extremely ugly war for everyone concerned. I'd rather be on the Israeli side of the border, to be honest, if it happens, but that's a very little comfort, because I think Israel's home front will be hit in a way that it has never been hit in our history. It will be devastated. And so that's another issue that Israel wants the US to address, preferably as part of the agreement, but in any event. And there's an expectation to have very close and intimate strategic coordination here about all of the Iran-related issues. In terms of Pakistan, look, they can talk about playing whatever mediating role that they wish between the US and Iran. That's maybe good for their own political positioning. No one expects them to have any role whatsoever in doing so. Okay. Certainly the US isn't going to turn to Pakistan to be the intermediary here. And I believe, I do not follow Pakistan very closely. I'm sure you're far more familiar than I am. Maybe there's been an improvement in their relations with Iran in recent years. I think there has. But I think the bottom line is always there, which is that no country wants to see a nuclear power on their border. And especially one which there is some degree of tension with Pakistan as a Sunni state. But I don't think that's the primary issue between them. The primary issue is that it's an unstable regime, or has been in the past, and you don't know who might succeed this regime, when. You don't know what hands it might fall into within the regime today, what control that gives them over a nuclear capability. And as long as Pakistan is nuclear, even if Iran were to go nuclear, I think that would remain a source of, it's not their primary concern in life. They're worried mostly about the US. I think today they're worried about Israel, but that is something that I believe they take into account.
Great, Professor. I think we really had a very fine, a brilliant address, and an equally brilliant conversation, and very patiently responded to all the questions. And I'm sure this was a session which so many of us really and thoroughly enjoyed due to its deep content. And in fact, in many ways, very candid, putting out your position very clearly. So this was fantastic. Thank you so much. With this, I now request Abhishek to give a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Abhishek.
Thank you, sir. I, Abhishek Verma, on behalf of the India Futures, want to extend my heartfelt gratitude towards Professor Charles. He quite brilliantly combined the event and put it into right perspective. Professor also analyzed various possible options available for Israel and its strategic implications. Thank you, Professor, for this excellent conversation. I also want to extend my gratitude to all the audience for their disciplined participation. Thank you.
Let me thank you once again for the invitation to be with you today, and especially for some really great questions that made it interesting and challenging for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you to have you here.
Thank you. Take care.